Jean, good morning.
Hello. Hi. Hi.
Hi, good morning. How are you doing?
Uh, it's a dark day here. The sun hasn't decided to come up. But other than
God.
that, let me just adjust this arrangement that I have here.
Okay, let
How
me
are you? How are
do.
you?
I'm going to quickly do an introduction. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of a live chat, Jugalbandi Series 5 with Jean Gardner. We are on episode number 16 in general, and this is really growing in an exponential manner. I have to thank all of our now Cube Edutor family members and community and friends. As I said last time, I will repeat again. From Melbourne to Mumbai, Shanghai to San Francisco. Actually, I should say Melbourne to Montreal, because those are the people. It's quite amazing that we have gathered some really wonderful minds, speakers, contributing. There have been a couple of questions I'm going to that have come offline before while Jean said. One was, I've had several people ask me what Jugalbandi means, and it's interesting. Jugalbandi is a very ancient term and an ancient process for two musicians to share the stage and play tunes, melodies, harmonies off of each other. There's no rehearsal and there's no preparation. They don't really know what the other is going to play. One leads and the other follows, and vice versa. And they go through this oscillation back and forth. And it's interesting to me that if it's somebody who doesn't come from this region or hasn't grown up in this region to not understand the word Jugalbandi, it's very Eastern-centric, so it makes perfect sense. But what I think is, again, relevant for our conversations today and the conversations we've been having is how several pieces of cultural history have been, by design, removed from our curricula. And so that children, youngsters, including myself growing up, and I'm not a youngster anymore. So we're looking at, the last 50 years of education, at least, if not more, has actually by design taken out relevant pieces of very phenomenal cultural history that our students today, I've had wonderful minds, extremely bright, extremely creative, extremely intelligent folks ask me, what is Jugalbandi? And it's sad that as a Pakistani or as an Indian or as an Iranian or somebody from this region to not know what that is. And that those students are right now studying in some of the top universities in either the US or Canada or Europe. So that's, I think, something to be looked into in terms of the conversations we're having about the role of regional cultural history and how it's by design been taken out of the history books, taken out of the curricula, and thrown into the background. So quite wonderful. So the people who've been asking me about Jugalbandi, and there have been multiple questions, that's your reason. And it's, look at how wonderful it is that Jean Gardner, who didn't know necessarily what it was, and she should know, she's not, asked me what it was, we explained it, and she's like, wait, that's perfect. This is what our series should be called, because you and I are bantering back and forth. We're not sure what the next step will be. And step by step, this creature is developing on its own. None of us really prepare or have a long-term agenda or a syllabus that we're following. We have these conversations, then we get feedback from you. We may have a slight touch base offline, but in general, it's leading itself. And that's why even she was so drawn to the idea of Jugalbandi. And Jean, my due apologies for speaking about you in the third person, because you're right here. But if you want to say something about Jugalbandi, this would be great. I just wanted the larger diaspora of people to understand why we've picked the term Jugalbandi. And in fact, you picked the term Jugalbandi. It wasn't my idea. You said, this is brilliant. Isn't that what we're doing? Let's call it Jugalbandi series. And I was like, okay, great, let's do it. So that's the one thing. The second thing is, I've had questions come up from many of our listeners and viewers who've been on the sidelines, in the wings, watching this conversation and enjoying it, sending me messages in my DM or my WhatsApp saying, can you share what's happening in terms of conversations with Jean offline? And the trouble is that not just conversations with Jean happening offline, there's conversations with each one of you happening offline. And basically, I kind of compile it, I share it with Jean, or share it with our next speaker is going to be, and take it from there. For instance, it was only after Marvi's conversation on Thursday that I figured that, our next person's profile should be XYZ. And, we've been talking about education, pedagogical framework, the future of the new narrative, how we're going to teach, how we're going to learn, how we're going to use my intuitive attraction magnetism to heritage architecture and to learning from sites, using the body to learn directly, repository of information which it shares without any filters, where you surrender yourself, mind, soul to these buildings and their geometry. And that building becomes an extension of our geometry to align universal geometries to the earth. And we become that channel, like the hourglass, the point in the middle, or for instance, in a yin-yang diagram, that middle line is what differentiates but also brings them together. And that line, I think, is the alignment that we want to be talking about. And obviously, not only cross-continental, but also cross-generational. So you'll be happy to know that the next guest in this Jugalbandi series on Thursday is an 18-year-old, so that loop in the generation for whom using digital technology is intuitive. It's not intuitive for me. It's maybe not so intuitive for Jean either. We're learning a new language. It is a language that doesn't come intuitively to us, because we've been wired in a very particular Western-centric, linear, old-school manner of learning. Teacher hands over information to student. Now, the idea that, for instance, I try a little bit in my classes when I teach, I know Jean does, which is why I am where I'm at today, is because of her, is participatory. How do we get the student-centric learning to happen? Natasha talked about this. So for those of you who think that there's this conversation happening offline, there isn't. We're really like picking up threads, picking up on threads of what people have left and putting it together. So one of the things that Jean and I have talked about is how wonderfully this whole process is stitching itself, almost like a stitch that's going in from her side to mine and with all of you in between. So we're quilting together in a free form, organic future of this new narrative. And so this, and then there's a boomerang. Thursday, it boomerangs out to you and then comes back to us on Monday. Then the next Thursday, it boomerangs to somebody else and comes back. But every Mondays, we take that new piece of thread and we stitch it through this quilt that we are co-creating in, and I'm using Jean's terms. So that's the general background on what Jugalbandi is, why we're using it. Behind me, to contextualize today and not waste too much time, behind me is a map that I'm not going to up and talk about, but it will be shared with you in the post. So whoever is interested in discussing the bubbles that you can see on those maps, on the map, this is basically my literal mind map of how I've seen sort of major points, 20 megacities of the world, which are only 20 because we're talking about a digital age which applies to every city across the world. Everybody has Wi-Fi, everybody has internet. I've picked out the main 20 cities that are similar in character, profile, population density, urban issues, social issues, philosophical issues, cross-cultural, cross-hemispheric. And the interesting thing that sort of, as I started doing this doodle, and I'm looking at trade routes, looking at how information was shared, I'm looking at, where East sits next to West, where is the Near East, where is the Far East. And if you look at this map, and we, for a second, make a few potentially blundering assumptions, but we make assumptions, we create a thesis. And we make the assumption that that landmass that's directly above my head from Tokyo to Portugal is one mass. Till 1492, at which point Christopher Columbus arrived and discovered the Americas had indigenous people, and they have an indigenous ancient history that we need to look at. Indigenous people's ancient histories are critical at this point. And ironically enough, by chance yesterday, I was watching a sci-fi film based in, I believe, 2091 called Prometheus. You've probably all seen Prometheus, the popular film that came out a few years ago. They set their mission to find their creators. And they meet, first meeting with the man who's the vision behind this project is a hologram. And that may be our of holograms, where we meet each other in a third dimension, in a completely new environment, in a new virtual architecture that's similar to what we have now, where time and space is collapsed, geography is collapsed, time zones are collapsed. But actually, we then take this one step forward and infuse ourselves into virtual environments that are holographic, and we bodily appear to each other in holograms and communicate in a three-dimensional, even though there's no tactility. It's at that point in the film that they also talk about how they went back to communication in stone tablets in ancient Egypt and further back, and took from them ideas about where people will be in the future. They refer to those people as engineers. And it's interesting that we should go back from a philosophical point of view to a scientific construction system of engineering and call those people engineers. It's one thing of that film that I highly recommend everyone to watch, because it really is in many ways. And what we are looking at doing here in terms of a step-by-step organic is potentially, in my mind, this map has made me suggest a conversation for today for all the viewers to contribute your thoughts, contribute your ideas, comments, critiques. Because what would happen if right here above my finger is an axis that is a north-south axis that cuts right through Pakistan, through this triangular area here, which was the cradle of civilization, Silk Route. And then the body of water that we call the Indus River is what connected them down to the Indian Ocean. The seafarers went in either direction around the globe. Pre-1492, pre-Christopher Columbus, pre the Americas as we know it today. So if you assume for a second, all of this history that we're looking at is from the 15th century to, let's say, the 9th century. We're looking at small, 600 years of history only, 700 years of history. It's a great place to start to look at the inventors, scholars, the philosophers, the astronomers, the astrologers, the mathematicians, the architects of the region we loosely call the Near East. Because Pakistan and the River Indus sits on the extreme eastern side of the area we call Near East. And Southeast Asia starts after Pakistan. We get lumped into it, but actually we're sitting at that doorway that then opens into the entire Southeast Asian region all the way to Taiwan. So you take Pakistan and then India and Myanmar and Bangladesh and Thailand and Indonesia, anything south of China. So we're literally at the door, the threshold of Southeast Asia. And that point where we're at the end of the Near East and at the beginning of the Southeast Asian, and in a horizontal west manner, and then north-south we connect from the early trade of the Silk Route, which is that triangle above my head right here that brings us down, end up sitting actually between Portugal and Tokyo, bang in the middle of this distance. So just as a conversation, it was fun to look at the forgotten philosophers, scholars, theoreticians, all the list I gave earlier of this region, from Lebanon to Afghanistan to Pakistan and potentially into India. We look at spirituality, we look at their alignment, their understanding of alignment to the stars, to the universal energies, to us as being astronauts on this little spaceship we call Earth. These are not my terms. This is terminology taken from artists like Andy Goldsworthy, who I've been taught by Jean. It's ideas taken from people like Buckminster Fuller about geometry and reconfiguring our understanding of the planet and the Earth and the Atlas, even though this is a sphere and I've flattened it up on a world map to do these diagrams and drawings. We want to obviously look at it as a holistic spherical environment that is moving, constantly moving. Its relationship to the sun and to the moon, its magnetic fields, how that affects our energy. And of course, as far as I'm concerned, expressing heritage architecture as an element that connects us from the earth to everything else. Jean, is that a fair contextualization for?
Well, coming from 7 a.m. On the other side of the earth,
yes,
and listening to this amazing, wonderful Jugalbandi. I have to say, what we just, all of you heard was my sense of Jugalbandi. And it's so auspicious when a sound comes to us that seems to embody what it is that we're doing. So Jugalbandi, musicians making sound. I mean, right. In my body, I can just see them responding to each other. And you mentioned several sounds. Sounds for me is the connector. And you mentioned how the sounds of the region are in this word, Jugalbandi. So sound is something common to all of us. We're making sounds right now across this collapse of space and time that we've just heard described so beautifully. And sound is so important to understand as a regional expression, in the sense that not of specific languages.
Right.
But when you make a sound in a place, the place shapes the sound. So Jugalbandi is something that we, not just musicians, they are experts at it. But Jugalbandi is what we all do all the time in trying to connect to each other in a place. So now we're talking about a place that has flattened our perception in terms of space and time, but there are still regions, and those regions are constructed, like we've just heard.
Yes.
And what does the construction have to do with the region and with the sound of the region? So what I'm trying to communicate is, out of what we just heard, which is such a extraordinary bringing together this moment when Zen and I reconnected after so many years and then can't stop talking to each other, that, you know, he is in Karachi. And just to make sure everybody understands that even though I am teaching in New York City and I live in New York City, because of the pandemic, I'm at my daughter's farm in rural Pennsylvania, in the Delaware River Valley, in an old stone barn, which you see the rafters of in back of me. So it turns out I'm in an older building than our host. So, yeah. And I have the earth, you know, not just when I go outside, and we're in a protected area, so there's just acres and acres of forests and woods and fields. But the extraordinary thing is that the birds, and in particular the hawks, that are riding on the wind and circling around, and the air is so clean and so visible. The planes aren't there anymore. So the sound of the hawks riding the wind and looking for a meal is the sound that the indigenous people used for joy. So wow. That to me is such an important thing to understand. Sound is relationship, whether it's the hawk just expressing the delight of being on the updraft and the downdraft and circling with other hawks. And the other day, sitting in the woods with my grandson at these survival villages that we've built, these hawks came zooming down so close we could hear the wings also. So here we have these joining space, time, hologram, sphere of the earth. But I want to remind us that sound, and right now my sound is mediated, and so is Zen's sound mediated. Zane, I'm so sorry, Zane. He's Zen for me. You know, he's wisdom embodied.
The sound is Z-E-N. It is Zen.
Oh, it is.
It is. You're right. Time.
Great.
Right time.
Okay. Good. Because I think this is the point at which this creative developing of the moment is not only joining space and time in the way that the maps that were just referred to show us, but also sound and place as a region that has no duplication anyplace else. So the cultural heritage that Zen was just talking about, there's a cultural heritage in every region. And the sounds that come out of the region are part of it, the music that's played in response to place, but also it makes hologram and geometry place-based and then in relationship. So here I am in a place, and here is Zen in a place, and through mediation, we are trying to relate these two different places. So to me, this is a very exciting moment with lots of challenges. And when Zen tells me where his listeners come from, you're already in places that need to take part in this effort, which is basically, and I think, you know, Jugalbandi is the word, because education throws us back into past meanings, which in the recent 250 years have not been in place. They've not kept how above, so below in a way that relates helps us retain our cultural identity across mediation. So mediation, that's another, you know, we've been struggling, Zen and I, to get it right, because we used to have so many Jugalbandi interruptions from the media technology wanting to take part and change things for us. So this is what I wanted to let you understand, stand under with me, and really let us know how, where you stand, the Jugalbandi, the sound, and intuition. I like the roots of words. Intuition is to see into the relationship. So good morning, everybody. I'm sure, I mean, of course, it's not morning other places, so I hope other people are wide awake.
So that's perfectly timed, because I was just going through who is joined, and we have today a friend of mine who joined us from New York, from Paris, from London, from Dubai, from Australia. Hisham is back from Shanghai. We have a friend from India, from Mumbai. We have, who else? We have Omar from Montreal, from Canada. This is amazing. And of course, we have a few friends from Karachi. We have a friend from Lahore and Islamabad. We have Amna, who's a phenomenal photographer from Lahore, who's joined us. Auntie Shaheen from Dubai. So, I mean, of the people that I'm recognizing, and I'm sorry, my apologies for those that I'm not so sure about where you are geographically. So, you know, Jean, this is really amazing, because you've just seen people are here from all different time zones. So not only have we managed to collapse your and my cross-continental time zone, but there's so many other people who are now part of this conversation. And I'm going to again reach out to everyone and say, when we're done with this chat, please send in your comments, questions, critiques, contributions. This map and the map that I referred to from Buckminster Fuller will be shared on the post, so you can look at them in peace in your own time. And also, there is a document that was created in my office, Jean, that I shared with you last night. You probably haven't had a chance to see it yet, of regional, I'm going to loosely call them Arab scholars and inventors from Lebanon to Iran, from I think the 11th and 12th century, who have done a lot of work in terms of geometry, in terms of mathematics, in terms of the spirituality that connects the two, how it's been translated by some into architecture, by others into machines to study astronomy. Really amazing, amazing things that one learn about in curriculum. So if we're talking about, let's say the topic for today, if I can rope us back, was navigating the future of balance. I would love to know what you think about what balance is today, how we can recreate balance and harmony because it's off. There's an age of abundance, and yet a lot of information is just noise and becoming clutter in the background. How do we align in your mind and start creating this future of balance? I mean, how does one do that?
You're asking me. You're asking me.
I'm
okay.
But I mean, for you and me to discuss, and anybody else who wants to pitch in, but at least, you know, where do you think one should begin?
Well, the word balance, probably, again, each of you, quote, translating it as far back into the sound that is your heritage, I think is tremendously important, because obviously Zen and I are speaking in English, and the sound of balance is dominated by the structure of the English language, which has become, quote, so efficient, so reductive, so unconnected to relationships. So balance. Well, I have lately been drawn to an indigenous group, not in Pennsylvania, where I am along in the Delaware Valley, but to the southwestern part of this continent, and in the mapped title of the United States, but a people, the Navajos, whose, in fact, that area of the earth, and I'd be interested in other areas, when you go back as far as we have sound as not as a written language yet. So the Navajos and that part of the United States called the Southwest, totally different regional ecology from where I am. But I've been strongly drawn there since a child, riding on horseback through the mountains over the years, from Montana all the way down to Arizona, and actually being taken by an honorary member of the Hopi Nation, which is in the area that's dominated acreage by the Navajos, taken to the ceremonies and sleeping out in the desert at night, and then going to Navajo healing ceremonies. So this is happening to all of us, and I am hesitant because those people whose place it is should be speaking for themselves. So with that hesitation, it brings up two things. Why was I drawn there? And Zen has also been drawn to that area.
Yes.
And when we talk about culture, and we talk about place, and standing or sitting on the living earth, and being drawn to certain places. So the living earth has energy that is radiating, emanating out of it, and possibly connecting us not only in present time, but past time. So in other words, where each of you may be drawn to, like we heard last Monday, Marv, about being drawn to the places in Karachi where water meets land. What
Marvi,
a powerful place.
Marvi.
Yeah, Marvi.
Hi, Marvi. Say hello.
Yeah, good.
Just...
She being drawn there, just going because her body is calling her to this place. So I've been called to this place. The desert couldn't be more different regionally, and trying to understand the idea of balance. Because in English, the idea of balance as people who have lived in a certain place since they crossed the strait between what we call Russia and Alaska and came down the continent to this extremely brutally beautiful place. So balance for them, I think a lot in English, it has come to mean a sort of static, symmetrical. The right side of me is just like the left side of me. And if you look at my face, that is not the case. So my face is a map also of attempts at balance where there's dynamic. So for them, there's a constant alertness to balance in place. And they refer to geographical shiprock. I cannot say the Navajo words, so I'm already corrupting them. But the four corners, which this area is called, are really the four corners of balance that goes back geologically. So balance, to me, the future of balance, has to do with all the things that we've been talking about, which I hope are drawing each of you to a place in yourself of resonance. It's dynamic. We know that the earth is out of balance. The pandemic and the climate emergency, long overdue for us who are living in we are little earth sprouts. You know, we move around, but we are in the earth when you include the atmosphere, which we have to. The earth as a living place for all the life forms that we need for survival, all the plants, the animals, the insects, the birds, all of that, we need the atmosphere. So what is balance? What is this dynamic? What is the future when we have a pandemic, when we're all locked down in place and we're talking about the importance of feeling the earth? And what is balance when the climate, which we, and that's another whole investigation, because we don't understand balance, we're out of alignment with the place and the earth and ourselves. We are born from the stars, from stardust, and that's not gobbledygook. That's a material reality. So the future of balance right now on one side is humanity thrown into, and that's you and me. I don't exempt myself. So this is where the hologram and the participation are one. We have this ability to step away from what we're in the midst of. And I'm struggling with how much of the political system that we see coalescing around these place-based imbalances, how much of that political system is co-opting the moment. So for the Navajos, and again, the words, they have two words, one for balance and one for imbalance. And I've never heard them said. I've seen the efforts to transliterate them into the alphabet we use today. But like your word, Jugalbandi, it has its own script. So these are all distancings. But we hopefully can understand ourselves as both a hologram and a participant. We are not able to survive without the balance that sees and knows that there are other forces with another idea of balance that's not participatory, that's hierarchical. And I'm hesitating to use the word evil because that creates a polarity. And Zen and I have been talking about the fact that the future of balance is to get us out of the polarities. Mm. At the same time that we understand that a lot of other things are bringing us together, like the digital. So that was a very long-winded, and I'm glad to say that Zen and I are both long-winded. So it's not one-sided. It's not. And we're trying very hard not to interrupt each other, which is another Navajo idea of balance. Listening. And we have a tendency to use in English to pay attention. But I'm finding that you give attention. It's a relationship. But I'm giving my attention to Zen when he's speaking, and the fast pace of the Jugalbandi of the streets of New York, where no one listens to the earth, no one listens to the stars, no one, except when there's a super moon like there has been this last week everywhere as the earth travels around the moon. They'll stop and suddenly say, oh my God, look at that. And it's very, very close to the earth. Ta-da. Thank you, Zen. And over to you.
You know, so wonderful listening to all these things. Then I go back in my head to memories that, as you said, memories that have been absorbed by my body, not just by a tape recorder in my head. All visit to these heritage sites where many times we have arrived a lot of our own noise, and I've had to guide people into stripping themselves, undressing themselves from those layers of clothing of noise that they carry with them, which gives them a sense of validation and gives them a sense of reality and gives them a sense that they exist. And when we get to heritage sites, I tell them that today, point, or however old you are, and you don't exist to that building, it doesn't care. It has, in its singularity, in its singular spot, its place, so many stories, so many sounds, so much music, so many dreams and prayers. You cannot even compare to come close to the magnificence of any particular moment in that building's history. So shed your garments and arrive with it, to it, ready to listen to it from all of your skin, from not just your ears, but your entire body, ready to listen to it, to absorb it. And they all think I'm crazy, that, you know, what building to us? I said, the highest talks to me every time I go, because I am silent and I leave all my rubbish at the door, shoot anything I can that is not going to get me arrested. And you know, it's interesting how civilization has bred us complacent and feel liberated in this web of constrictions, in this web of social boundaries, and this web of restrictions, which have internally created these elaborate distances between us and ourselves. The gap that exists between our skin and our soul is enormous.
Yes.
And I find it bizarre that if we're able to, that space between the skin and our hearts or our minds, or our souls, or our intuition, how are we likely to listen to anything that's been around for 4,000 years? And the ancients, our ancient predecessors, yours and mine, whether it was the Navajo, or it was the Egyptians, or the Mesopotamian Sumerians, or the Indus Valley civilization people, we're looking at 6,000 years of history that impact all of them. They all were involved in trade and economics. None of them existed as isolated events and entities. they have had a repercussion on all of Europe's development and civilization, on the Arab scholars, on Kant, on Rousseau. If we trace it back, and we assume that this was when the creative civilization developed between these three people, and we don't have a record of anything before that, doesn't mean it didn't exist. So I think we need to look at indigenous people. We need to look at the stories and the myths and the wood carvings of their lives, the hieroglyphics of the Maori, the Aborigine, the Aryan in this neighborhood, the Russian Eskimo, the Eskimo itself from Northern Europe, the Navajo, all the different plains and mountains, and Native Americans, the natives of South America. I think we're going to need to go back this far, because that makes sense in terms of the way the digital interface is designed. If we look at how the language of the digital world works, and those are the two we want to connect. Our book format, our linear Bible, the writing of X, the writing of Y, that's, the first scrolls from Egypt. I think the hieroglyphics are going to be more valuable, and their tablets. I mean, for instance, Jean, we both know that there is still a question about what were mummies really mummified with. We have found mummies in China who haven't aged, their skin hasn't aged at all. The Egyptian mummies have, and we found that science has found traces of cocaine. So if there were traces of cocaine in Egyptian mummies, means trade happening for cocoa across to the Americas way before Christopher Columbus was even conceived of, let alone got lost and arrived by default. Poor man, he was out looking for Asia, and then arrived and then caused all this confusion. But there are so many things that history is just taken out or left or lost or forgotten. And I think those are the pieces of history that actually are more relevant to us today. If we are to start talking about a future, a new narrative, then we need to find the gaps, the holes, the dissidents, the fractures. Marvi mentioned this. She talked about the fracture in architecture. And I think the word fracture sounds perfect for that skill that we need to go into, like Marianne French, and actually find the giant squid for our future narrative, in my mind. That's what I think is our direction, to find this new balance.
Well, you've brought up
the giant squid.
Key fractures. And one of them is the word civilization. So the narrative that we've been living will, as many of you know, maybe grudgingly start with ancient Egypt. So the dominant narrative about civilization will often include, if you look at the printed narrative, it'll start a timeline at ancient Egypt, where the word civilization is civic, citizen. It doesn't have ancient roots in the way that Zen and I have been talking about it. Yeah. And it's very much connected. We have to remember that in Greece, the cities were states in relationship to our narrative about nations. So in other words, the citizens were people living in city independent states. So this word civilization is connected to living in this urbanized way. And that urbanization has, over the centuries, been one of the primary architectural forces in disconnecting us from what you were just describing. So it's one of the reasons that you go outside the city to find these places. They're still in the city, in the cities. New York City, 1/4 of the city has the living earth. And it's marked out on the maps and labeled as parks. And lo and behold, most people living in cities think of it as some kind of museum exhibit. They don't realize this was here before them.
Right.
The rhythm of that place is not the same as the rhythm of a city. So civilization is one of the dynamics that has cut us off. And in the way that you just talked about, and that we all know, it cut us off completely from
Yes.
that part of the world that
Yes.
you've just been, and this is one of the joys for me of talking with Zen. We come from different sides of the earth, and we have different, and he is much more highly educated than I. He speaks many languages. He's been to New York. He's been to Santa Fe, New Mexico. You know, he's traveled. And my traveling has not been that fortunate. But then I want to talk about ancient Egypt, because the fractured narrative is one that, again, if you look at the dominant narrative, it never mentions the placement of the pyramids.
Yes.
How did, you know, they're placed on the earth in
Yeah.
exactly the same way we find Stonehenge, we find the native buildings, indigenous buildings in any landmass. And again, I say this with hesitation, but there seems to have been a point historically when Egypt and all those complexes dedicated to animal-headed embodiments of forces in the natural world.
Yes.
That was the teaching center. It was known at, people came, you know, from as far away as the part of the world that Zen was just describing and the part of the world I was just describing. They came to study. And what they were studying is the same kind of thing that we're talking about now, but we're brought together by a collapse in space and time. So the most of what we now call sacred sites anywhere are concentrated in Luxor. And the libraries and the manuscripts that were hidden in caves, all of this obliterated by the Crusades. And when you steal the heritage, Sophia becomes Eve. So there are these narratives that have been co-opted. That's the word in English.
Yes.
Coming
Yes.
from that time that you're talking about.
Yeah.
So it reminds me right now of efforts to realize that we have, I love the word fractured, because we have fracking and oil and bringing out things that the earth has kept out of the atmosphere, but we've also fractured soil.
Yes.
And soil is what we eat, and human comes from humus, which is soil, and humanity. We're earth sprouts. So there is an effort to eat this new narrative by rejuvenating the soil and using the living soil as a source of this new narrative, whether it's the food that we eat and the seasons that we eat with that food in, because that's what's available, but also the building materials. So I point to the rafters that you see behind me. You'll have to trust me that the stone for the stone barns and the stone houses and the spring houses and the other buildings all come out of the bedrock right here, built by the Quakers. So impositions, but using native meaning of this place. And then what are the clothes that we wear? How do we rejuvenate our bodies when we're in this mediated world that we all hope we can reconnect to this living heritage? Well, then if your bodies, if you use material clothes made from the materials that's living organism of soil, like fibers, or animals that eat the grasses that grow from the living earth, wool, leather, but again, not in excess. I mean, you can't, I get, I'm in the dark, but you can't see this shirt. I have had it for so long that I wouldn't want to turn around because there are worn spots. And it's, in other words, can we just wear a few pieces of clothing, not so many, and if we do, can it be living materials? Because my point is we want to amplify our bodies in the midst of this new narrative. And there are ways to reconnect our bodies without civilization fracturing us and cutting us off. And ancient Egypt is a nexus. Whether it's the only place where this kind of, I mean, I think people can argue very coherently that this is where the man we call Jesus went in the missing years when he was a teenager. This is where Pythagoras went. In other words, the commonality of cultivating in place, culture is cultivating in place, was taught in a place. And now Zen and I are talking about, can we create a commonality that respects all that we are beginning to realize place, and we're all in a place, has still. And the earth, which is trying so hard to wake us up. We killed all the big animals, so now the little tiny viruses are coming to pinch us and say, okay, wake up, wake up. So this new narrative, I think, is a very exciting moment for all of us to be here. And animal-headed gods embodying ancient forces in ancient Egypt. Whoa. This is Zen's persona, co-creating with the animals. Can we listen?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I learned so much from them. So the animal-headed gods we see in Egypt, the animal-headed gods we see in the Native Americans, we see them in the Maori, they keep recurring. So it's obviously not something that's whimsical or irrelevant. It's extremely relevant. And I think everything that we've been taught as being irrelevant is now relevant. And we need to to those resources, those forgotten resources, and bring them to the forefront and start giving them mainstream value so that the digital age can be looked at as a language into the new normal. It's what you and I worked on where in 1994, 95, when I was at Columbia and you were a consultant on the new technologies in education, we were working with Frank Moretti and looking at Marshall McLuhan's ideas and thoughts. Well, here it is. Now we're in, and it's time to implement. So we need to talk about, also I have questions for you regarding Vitruvius Man and the machine, the brain that lives on our skin, proportions, and the role of the navel that we often forget, and the umbilical cord, and how it connects us not only to the universe, but to the earth and our roots. But once again, as usual, we're out of time, just as the conversation is getting really exciting. But let's pick up on this. If anybody else has any other ideas, G, welcome from India. Let's pick up on this again next week. G, go deeper. I think we should go deeper. For me, the Egyptian nexus and the nexus here, that triangle, that womb-like female organ meeting the male is for me very, very interesting in terms of cultural history. So I think we need to start looking at this and then expand out of it, go back to the ancient thinkers in this region and extract what has been forgotten by design. Thank you so much, Jean. Once again, good morning to you. Brilliant conversation. Thanks for shaking us all up. Thank you all for joining me from all over the world. I find it super humbling. Really glad to have all of you with us and look forward to the offline comments, conversations that continue. In the meantime, I'm going to start this. Jean, that's another word for you to learn. We need to get you to speak Urdu also. So Jugalbandi is one word. Assalamu alaikum is how we say greet each other. And Khuda is our goodbyes. So till Monday, I will see you then. Thank you all so much. Take care of yourselves. Continue quarantining. Khuda to everyone. Take care. Bye.
Bye.